At my daughter's wedding, her groom told me to leave. That moment shattered everything I thought I knew about my family and my place in their lives. I had spent years imagining this day, the day I would proudly walk my daughter down the aisle, watch her exchange vows, and maybe even shed a tear of joy as I saw her begin a new chapter. Instead, I found myself standing in front of hundreds of people, my heart pounding in my chest, as the young man who was supposed to become part of my family looked me straight in the eye and told me I wasn't welcome. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The words hit me harder than any blow I had ever taken in my 70 years of life. I could still hear the exact phrasing, sharp and cold. You don't belong here. Leave before you embarrass us. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. The music faded, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breath as I struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispers rippling like wind through the hall. My daughter didn't say a word, didn't lift a finger to stop him. She stood there, in her white dress, her hand tightly entwined with his, her eyes hard and unyielding, as though she had been waiting for this moment. That silence from her was louder than his cruel words. I had been looking forward to this day for so long. I had helped plan every detail, from the venue to the flowers to the carefully chosen menu. I had poured my heart and my savings into it because I wanted her to have the perfect wedding, the kind of wedding her late mother would have dreamed of for her. I thought I was doing the right thing, thought I was making her dreams come true. But as I stood there, frozen in front of 100 eyes, it became clear that to them, I was not part of the dream. I was an inconvenience, an embarrassment, someone they wanted hidden away so they could parade their picture-perfect lives without the reminder of the old man who had sacrificed everything to get them here. The humiliation burned. My cheeks flushed hot, my hands trembled, and for the first time in decades, I felt truly powerless. I looked around the room, hoping to find a sympathetic face, someone who might come to my defense, but all I saw was discomfort, pity, and the subtle satisfaction of those who had always looked down on me. I had worked my whole life to be respected, and in that single moment, it was as if all my years of sacrifice had been erased. The groom smirked slightly, confident, sure of his dominance. My daughter averted her eyes, and that cut deeper than any insult. It wasn't just his cruelty, it was her complicity that broke me. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to remind them of everything I had done to get us all here. But my throat tightened, and the words stuck. My feet felt heavy, glued to the floor, while my heart screamed for me to fight. Yet, something inside me whispered, "Not now, not here, not in front of them." So I turned. I turned slowly, each step echoing in my ears. As I walked toward the exit, their whispers following me like shadows. The music swelled again as if nothing had happened, but inside me a storm had begun. I could feel the rage and grief intertwining, settling deep into my bones. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I clenched my fists and stared up at the sky, trying to calm the tremor in my chest. The words repeated in my mind like a curse. "You don't belong here." They had no idea what those words had unleashed in me. They thought they had humiliated an old man and sent him away quietly, but they had no idea what I was capable of. I may have walked away from that wedding hall, but I wasn't leaving in defeat. No, that was just the beginning. The silence after his words felt like a weight crushing down on me, heavier than any burden I had carried in my long life, and I had carried plenty. I stood there, my ears ringing, as though the air itself had been sucked out of the room. For a few endless seconds, the entire hall seemed frozen in time, and every pair of eyes in that lavishly decorated venue was glued to me. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed for me. Others let their curiosity linger, while a few watched with something close to amusement. I could hear the low whispers begin, rippling from table to table, sharp fragments of judgment cutting into me like knives. Did you hear what he said? Why would they do that to him? Maybe he did something to deserve it. That last thought pierced me deeply, because I knew there were some who wanted to believe I had brought this humiliation upon myself. I turned my head toward my daughter, desperate to see some flicker of hesitation, some trace of love, some sign that she would speak up for me, but all I found were her cold eyes. Those eyes I had once known as warm and filled with childlike wonder now stared back at me with a detached indifference that made my blood run cold. She looked at me as though I were a stranger, or worse, a nuisance she had been forced to tolerate for far too long. There was no love in them, no gratitude, no hesitation, only a chilling resolve to stand silently by the man who had just stripped me of my dignity in front of everyone. I had dreamed of seeing her as a bride for so many years, dreamed of that moment when she would smile at me, perhaps even whisper a thank you for everything I had done, but instead, her expression made it clear that I had no place in this chapter of her life. My throat tightened, my face burned, and my hands shook at my sides. I could feel the blood rushing to my cheeks, a hot flush of shame that spread across my entire body. Never in all my years had I felt so exposed, so utterly powerless, standing in the center of that ornate hall with its polished chandeliers and glittering decorations, all of which I had paid for, while being treated as if I were nothing. The sound of someone's stifled laugh in the back cut me to the core, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself, but the humiliation was too raw, too overwhelming. I tried to look at the guests, but every face seemed to carry pity, the kind of pity that only deepens the wound because it confirms your disgrace. They weren't seeing a proud father on his daughter's wedding day. They were seeing a man discarded, rejected, publicly humiliated in the cruelest way possible. My knees felt weak, and for a moment I thought I might collapse right there in front of them, but I forced myself to stand tall even as my spirit crumbled inside. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but endure the burning sting of betrayal and the suffocating weight of their judgmental eyes. The whispers grew louder, the rustle of clothes, the uncomfortable clearing of throats, all of it merging into a chorus of shame that echoed in my ears long after the moment passed. And through it all, her eyes never softened, never wavered. That cold gaze from my daughter, my only child, told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't her father anymore. I was just the old man they wanted to erase from the picture. As I stood there, frozen in the aftermath of their cruel dismissal, my mind began to unravel years of memories that weighed far heavier than the silence in that hall, each one pressing against my chest until I could hardly breathe, and with every passing second I was forced to reckon with the truth of how much I had given and how little I had been left with in return. I remembered the endless nights working double shifts at the factory, the ache in my back and the sting in my eyes as I pushed myself past exhaustion so that she would never have to go without, so she could wear the finest clothes to school, so she would never feel the shame of poverty that had haunted me in my own childhood. I remembered the mornings when I skipped breakfast so she could have more on her plate, telling her I wasn't hungry when in truth my stomach growled like an angry animal, but the look of contentment on her young face was enough to silence my hunger. I remembered selling the car I had loved, an old but reliable companion, just to afford her tuition at a private school because I wanted her to have opportunities I could never dream of, opportunities her mother would have wanted for her. When she set her sights on college, I didn't hesitate. I drained savings accounts, took loans I knew would take years to repay, and labored through weekends while others rested, all so she could walk onto a campus with her head held high and her future wide open. Every accomplishment she achieved, every award she held in her hands, felt like a victory carved from the calluses of my own hands, a reward for every sleepless night, every sore muscle, every bead of sweat that fell from my brow. And yet, those memories cut me deeper now than any insult the groom could hurl at me. I thought of the time she came to me with requests that went far beyond what I could comfortably afford: the designer dresses, the vacations with friends, the shiny new phone. She insisted she needed to keep up with her peers, and how I never once told her no, even when it meant falling behind on bills or going without new shoes for myself. I told myself that one day she would understand, that one day she would look back and see the sacrifices her father had made, and she would be proud. She would be grateful. She would love me not only as her parent, but as the man who had given her everything. But standing there, with her cold eyes turned on me, I realized that day would never come. I thought of the house, the one I had built with my own 2 hands after her mother passed, pouring every ounce of my grief and love into those walls so she would always have a place to call home, a place where she could feel safe. I had patched every leak, repainted every room, repaired every broken step, not for myself but for her, so she could walk through life without ever feeling the cracks beneath her feet. And now, that home meant nothing to her. I remembered birthdays when I worked extra hours just to afford the cake she had her heart set on, the Christmas mornings when I wrapped second-hand gifts in shiny paper to make them look new, the way her eyes lit up when she tore the paper away, and how that joy had been enough to keep me going. But those same eyes, once filled with innocence and wonder, now stared through me as though I were a ghost. The hurt was unbearable. My heart ached, not from the groom's words, but from the undeniable truth that my daughter, my only daughter, had chosen to let me be humiliated rather than stand beside me, the man who had stood beside her all her life. Every memory of sacrifice that once brought me pride now felt like a cruel joke, a reminder that I had poured out my soul for someone who saw me not as a father, but as a bank, a stepping stone, a disposable relic of her past. The moment those cold eyes met mine, the dam inside me broke, and memories I had long tucked away came rushing back with a force I could not stop. Memories of a life built out of sacrifice and a love so fierce it burned me hollow. Memories that began the day I buried my wife, the day I became both father and mother to a little girl who barely understood what death meant. I still remember holding her tiny hand at the graveside, her fingers trembling as she clung to me, her eyes wide and confused as she asked when her mother was coming home, and I, choking back tears, promised her that she would never be alone as long as I lived. From that day forward, every decision I made, every breath I took, was for her. I gave up the idea of remarrying, not because I didn't crave companionship, not because I didn't feel the sting of loneliness creeping into the quiet nights, but because I could not bear the thought of dividing my love, could not bear the thought of her feeling second to anyone. I chose her happiness over my own, again and again, because she was all I had left, the last living piece of the woman I had adored. I remember working myself to the bone, stumbling into our small house late at night, too tired to eat, but still tiptoeing into her room just to make sure she was breathing softly in her sleep, safe under the blanket I had tucked around her before I left for my second job. I remember the mornings when I packed her lunch, writing silly little notes on napkins so she would feel her mother's love through my clumsy words, notes she would proudly show me after school. I remember when she was 8 and wanted to take ballet lessons, how my heart sank at the cost, but how I still went out and fixed roofs on weekends, balancing on old ladders with aching knees just to afford the pink slippers and tutus that made her spin with joy. When she wanted a bigger bedroom as she grew older, I gave up my own, moving into the smaller one so she could have the space to spread out her books and clothes, telling her I preferred it anyway, even though I spent years bumping my elbows against the narrow walls of that cramped room. I never bought myself new clothes, never went on vacations, never indulged in the hobbies I once loved, because every spare dollar, every ounce of energy went to giving her the life I believed she deserved. When she was sick, I slept sitting up beside her bed, holding her hand through the fevers, whispering stories about her mother to comfort her until she drifted back to sleep. When she cried over bullies at school, I swallowed my anger and told her she was stronger than their words, even though it broke me to see her hurting. I was her shelter, her shield, her provider, her everything, and I never once thought of myself first. And now, standing in that hall, stripped of dignity, told to leave by the man she chose, with her silent approval, those memories cut me deeper than knives, because they were proof of all I had poured into her life, and yet none of it had been enough to keep her love, none of it had been enough to make her stand by me when it mattered most. I had given her everything after her mother's death, every ounce of my soul, every dream I had pushed aside, every comfort I denied myself, and still, in the end, she looked at me with eyes that said I was disposable, nothing more than a relic of a past she had outgrown. I should not have been surprised when the groom told me to leave, because the truth is, I had already seen the cracks in his facade, already heard the venom in his voice when he thought I wasn't listening, and the memory of it haunted me as I stood there drowning in shame. A few days before the wedding, I had walked into the reception hall earlier than expected to finalize some of the payments with the coordinator, and that was when I heard him, the man who was supposed to cherish my daughter, the man I had foolishly welcomed into my home, speaking to his friends with a sneer in his tone that made my skin crawl. The old man should stay out of sight, he had said, his voice dripping with disdain. He's just a burden, hobbling around like he owns the place because he's footing the bill. He doesn't know when his time is up. My stomach had dropped hearing those words, and I remember standing there, hidden behind the doorway, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the wall to steady myself. The words echoed over and over again in my head, searing themselves into me because they weren't spoken in jest, they weren't careless remarks, they were said with intent, with the cruel arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. His friends chuckled in response, not one of them speaking against him, and in that laughter I heard the confirmation of everything I had tried to ignore, that in his eyes I was nothing more than a stepping stone, a wallet disguised as a father, someone to be tolerated until the checks cleared and the papers were signed. I remember feeling a hollowness spread through me as I listened to him continue, boasting about the life he and my daughter would have after the wedding, about how my role was simply to pay and then disappear, and he spoke about me like I wasn't even a person, like I was an obstacle, something to be pushed aside, and the worst part was the way he laughed, so confident that my daughter agreed with him, so certain that she shared his disdain. I wanted to burst in right then, confront him, demand that he say those words to my face, but something in me held back, a flicker of hope that maybe I had misheard, that maybe my daughter would defend me, that she still carried the love I had spent her entire life giving her. But when I saw her later, and the way she barely looked at me, the way her voice carried that same edge of impatience whenever I asked her a question, I knew the truth. She had heard those words before, maybe not spoken aloud, but whispered in the way he treated me, and she had chosen to stay silent. That realization hurt more than his arrogance, because it told me she had accepted his view of me, maybe even embraced it. I carried that wound into the wedding day itself, burying it deep because I didn't want to cause a scene, didn't want to ruin what I thought was her happiness. But when his words finally came, sharp and unrelenting in front of everyone, they landed on a heart already cracked, already bleeding from the cruelty I had overheard. His arrogance was not new. It was simply unmasked, and the way my daughter stood by him told me she had never intended to stop him. I was not her proud father that day. I was the old burden he had mocked, the man they believed should stay out of sight, and in the cruelest twist of fate, they had made sure that was exactly where I ended up. What burned deeper than the groom's arrogance was the coldness of my own daughter, a chill that had crept into her voice and her manner in the months leading up to the wedding, a chill I had tried to ignore, convincing myself it was stress, nerves, the overwhelming weight of planning such a grand event. But in truth, it was indifference, a lack of gratitude that pierced me more cruelly than any stranger's insult. I remembered the way she spoke to me whenever I asked about the details of the arrangements I was paying for, her tone sharp and dismissive, as if my questions were a nuisance rather than the natural concerns of a father giving everything he had. "Don't worry about it, Dad," she would snap, her eyes glued to her phone, her attention elsewhere, her words stripped of any warmth. When I tried to express pride, telling her how beautiful she looked in the dress I had purchased, she didn't smile or thank me. Instead, she rolled her eyes, muttering that it was the least I could do, as if decades of sacrifice had been nothing more than a down payment for her wedding day. Each interaction carried that same thread of detachment, a subtle but unmistakable message that she no longer saw me as her anchor, her protector, her father, but simply as the man signing checks. I remembered one evening when I suggested we sit together and go over the seating chart, something I thought might be a chance to share in the excitement, only for her to sigh loudly and tell me she didn't have time for my old-fashioned opinions, that the planner and the groom had it handled. The words stung, not because of their bluntness, but because of the way she dismissed me without even looking up, as though my presence in the room was irrelevant. I thought back to the countless moments when I had dropped everything to be by her side: school recitals, doctor's visits, the late nights she cried over heartbreaks, and how in those moments I had been her world, her safe place. Now, as her wedding approached, I was reduced to an afterthought, a shadow lingering at the edges of her new life. Even the small gestures that once bound us together had vanished. Where she once hugged me absent-mindedly when passing through the kitchen, now there was only distance. Where she once confided in me about her fears, now there was silence. And when I searched her eyes for the little girl I had raised, the girl who once clung to me after nightmares and whispered that she never wanted me to leave her, all I found was the cool detachment of a woman who seemed ashamed of the man who had given her everything. That indifference ate away at me, far more than anger ever could, because it was proof that love had not only faded, but perhaps had never truly taken root. Gratitude, it seemed, had never been part of her heart, and all the sacrifices I had made were invisible to her, dismissed as obligations rather than gifts born of love. Remembering those moments now, in the wake of her silence as her groom told me to leave, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. She had been preparing to cast me aside long before that day. Her coldness was not sudden but deliberate, a slow unraveling of the bond I had once believed unbreakable. And that truth hollowed me out more than humiliation ever could, because it forced me to face the possibility that I had poured my soul into raising a daughter who had stopped loving me long before I was ready to let her go. When I finally returned home from that cursed wedding, the silence of my house was deafening, a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest and filled every corner like a suffocating fog. And I sat there in my worn chair, the one I had collapsed into after countless long days of labor, staring at the walls that had once been filled with laughter, now echoing only with the memory of betrayal. I had no music to drown out the ache in my heart, no voice to soothe me, no one to tell me that it would be all right. I was alone, truly and utterly alone, and in that solitude the truth became impossible to ignore. I thought of the life I had lived, every decision I had made, every hour I had spent working, sacrificing, giving of myself until there was nothing left, and for what? To be humiliated in front of strangers by the man my daughter chose, while she stood silently by his side, her eyes colder than ice. As I sat there in the dim glow of the lamp, my mind began to unravel the bitter truth that had been staring at me all along. I had been used, not just once, not just in the moment of my public disgrace, but for a lifetime. They had taken my labor, my money, my time, my love, and repackaged it as expectation, entitlement, a duty I owed rather than a gift I gave. My sacrifices had been their stepping stones, my exhaustion their comfort, my dreams their luxuries, and I, blinded by love, had allowed it, even encouraged it, thinking I was building a legacy of care and devotion, never realizing that I was raising people who would see me only as a resource to drain until I had nothing left to give. The pain of that realization was unbearable. My chest ached with every breath, my throat burned with words I would never say to them, words of disappointment, words of truth. I thought back to all the times I had been brushed aside with dismissive tones, the unspoken assumption that I would always be there to pay, to fix, to provide. I remembered the groom's smug laughter, the whispers at the wedding, my daughter's silence, and together they became a chorus of cruelty, mocking me in my solitude. I stared at my hands, calloused and worn from decades of labor, hands that had built a home, paid for an education, carried a child through storms of grief. And I realized those same hands had also built my own prison, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, until I was nothing more than the caretaker of everyone else's comfort, my own needs and dignity buried beneath theirs. Alone in that room, I felt the crushing weight of wasted years, of love squandered on those who could not value it, and it hollowed me out until I was nothing but a shell of the man I once believed myself to be. Yet beneath the grief, beneath the humiliation, and the unbearable sting of betrayal, something else stirred, faint but growing, a flicker of resolve. For the first time in decades, I saw my life with clear eyes, stripped of illusion, and I understood that if I continued to give, if I continued to bend, there would be nothing left of me. I had been used by the people I loved most, and that truth cut me to the core, but within that wound, a seed of something colder, sharper, began to take root. It was the breaking point. The moment my pain began to transform into something else entirely, something that would soon become the fire to burn away every lie I had been told about love and loyalty. I sat in that suffocating silence, with the weight of humiliation crushing my chest, until at last the grief inside me began to twist and change, hardening into something sharper, colder, more dangerous than sorrow could ever be, and I felt the shift as clearly as if a storm had broken inside my soul. For hours I had drowned in memories of sacrifice, in the hollow ache of wasted years, but the longer I stared at the shadows dancing across the walls of my lonely home, the more those memories ignited a fury that would not be contained. The tears that had once threatened to fall dried in my eyes, replaced by a burning clarity. I realized I had spent my life as the silent provider, the dependable figure in the background who never asked for thanks, who never demanded respect, who gave and gave until there was nothing left of himself. And for what? To be cast aside like a worn-out tool, to be told I did not belong at my own daughter's wedding, to see the child I had carried through life stand beside a man who mocked me, her eyes filled not with shame or regret, but with cold dismissal. The old me might have curled into himself, swallowed the pain, and accepted that fate as if it were unavoidable, but that man was dead the moment I was told to leave. What lived now inside my chest was no longer grief but anger, righteous and unstoppable, a current that surged through my veins and stiffened my spine. I had been their foundation, their bank, their servant cloaked in the name of Father, and in return they had shown me nothing but contempt. They believed my love made me weak, that my patience made me blind, that I would endure anything so long as it came from them. They were wrong. As I sat there, fists tightening until my knuckles ached, I vowed that I would never again be the silent provider they thought they could exploit. I would not continue to be the man who fixed everything while they reaped the rewards. If they wanted to strip me of dignity, if they wanted to expose me before the world as nothing, then I would show them what it meant when nothing remained of me to give. The grief I carried had been fuel, and now that fuel had become fire, a cold, controlled fire that burned away the last traces of weakness in me. I no longer cared for their approval, their love, their acceptance, because I finally understood that those things had never truly been mine. What I cared for now was balance, justice, and the satisfaction of watching their arrogance collapse beneath the weight of their own greed. They had mistaken me for a man who could be broken, but what they had done instead was awaken a part of me I had buried long ago, the part that knew how to fight, how to endure, how to strike when the moment was right. No longer would I be the quiet shadow in their lives. I would be the reckoning they never saw coming. My grief had died in that wedding hall, and in its place was born a resolve as sharp as glass, a resolve that whispered in my ear with every beat of my heart, no more. They thought they had humiliated me beyond repair, that I would shuffle back into obscurity and lick my wounds like some discarded relic. But what they did not know, what they could not even imagine, was that every thread of their grand wedding tapestry had been woven with my money. Every shining light, every blooming flower, every bite of food on the menu, all of it paid for by the man they had tried to erase. As I sat in my living room, anger solidifying into cold determination, I could not help but let a grim smile creep across my face, because I alone held the hidden leverage, the kind of power they were too arrogant to notice. The venue they so proudly paraded, with its marble floors and towering chandeliers, was secured under my name and my bank account. The catering service, with its endless trays of delicacies and flowing champagne, had been booked and advanced with my signature. The florist who had promised cascading arrangements of roses and lilies, the photographer hired to immortalize every moment, The designer who stitched together the white gown my daughter wore as if it were spun from clouds, all of them were on my payroll. Even the honeymoon, the luxury getaway they bragged about to their friends, a vacation they claimed to have meticulously planned, had been funded by me, every last cent. The realization was both sobering and electrifying, because in their arrogance they had forgotten the most important detail of all. They owned nothing, not the day, not the memories, not even the debts tied to it. I had built their dream upon my foundation, and foundations can be pulled away. They thought their insult had stripped me of worth, but in truth it had handed me the sharpest weapon imaginable, the weapon of control. Without my support, their perfect day was nothing more than smoke and mirrors, an illusion ready to collapse at the slightest push. I replayed the groom's smirk in my mind, the coldness in my daughter's eyes, and with each recollection, I felt the power of this truth settle more firmly in my hands. They believed they had erased me, but they had bound their fate to me more tightly than ever. Their pride blinded them to it, their greed made them careless, and their entitlement made them believe I would never dare to pull away what I had so freely given. But that night, as the shadows deepened and my anger turned to icy resolve, I swore I would no longer be the silent provider who carried their world on his shoulders. I would show them that everything they had so arrogantly flaunted existed because I had allowed it to, and, with a single decision, a few phone calls, I could bring it all crashing down. The venue, the food, the flowers, the memories, they belonged to me, and if I chose to take them back, they would be left with nothing but the echo of their own cruelty. They had told me I did not belong at their wedding, and so I would honor their wish. I would erase myself, not just from the hall, but from the very fabric of the event, pulling every stitch I had sewn until the entire thing unraveled before their eyes. That was my leverage, hidden in plain sight, and soon it would become their downfall. The anger that had been burning in my chest did not lead me to reckless outbursts or wild gestures. No, it sharpened my mind, steadied my hands, and guided me into the clarity of a plan, calm and methodical, a plan that would dismantle everything they had built on my back. I woke the next morning with a resolve I had not felt in years, and instead of wallowing in sorrow, I brewed a cup of coffee, sat at my worn kitchen table, and pulled out the folder that contained every contract, every invoice, every receipt tied to the wedding they had paraded as their own. The very sight of those papers brought a grim satisfaction, because they were all under my name, my accounts, my signature. Slowly, deliberately, I picked up the phone and began to make my calls. The first was the venue, that grand hall of marble and chandeliers where I had been told I did not belong. My voice was steady, polite, almost cordial, as I informed the manager that I would no longer be responsible for any outstanding balances, that the financial responsibility would now fall directly on the bride and groom. I could hear the hesitation in the manager's voice, the shuffle of papers as he confirmed my name on the contract, the realization dawning that the couple who had acted so entitled were nothing without the old man they had cast aside. I hung up the phone and felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a small but satisfying strike in a larger war. One by one, I went down the list. The caterer, whose delicacies had been hand-picked to impress a crowd of social climbers, listened as I explained that payments would no longer be processed from my account. "You'll need to speak with them directly," I said calmly, imagining the shock that would ripple through their perfect little world when they received the bill. The florist was next, then the photographer, then the designer who had sewn every bead and stitch into the dress my daughter wore as though it were a crown. Each conversation was precise, unemotional, efficient. I gave no explanation beyond the simple fact that I was no longer financially involved. And with each call, I felt my power returning, piece by piece. By the time I reached the travel agency to cancel the honeymoon package, a bitter laugh escaped me, not of humor but of irony, because I could still hear the groom bragging about the trip to his friends, boasting about the luxury he had never earned, oblivious to the truth that it was never his to claim. Now it was gone, as easily as snapping my fingers. With every vendor removed from my ledger, I imagined the dominoes beginning to fall, the once seamless dream now riddled with cracks that would soon shatter under the weight of unpaid bills and unmet obligations. The thought of their smug smiles twisting into panic filled me with a satisfaction deeper than any apology could have offered. I did not rush through the process. I savored it, each call a carefully placed stone in the path of their downfall. And when the last call was made, when the last contract had been severed from my name, I sat back in my chair and let the silence of the house surround me once more. Only this time it was not the silence of humiliation, but the silence of control. The silence of a man who had taken back what was his and prepared to show them the cost of their arrogance. They had thought they could discard me, but now the balance of power had shifted entirely, and the perfect wedding they had so proudly claimed as their own was about to crumble into ruin, all because they forgot the one truth they should have remembered. Nothing they had was truly theirs. In the days that followed, I realized my revenge could not rely on petty gestures or half measures. It needed to be airtight, precise, and utterly unshakable. And that meant calling in the people who lived and breathed in the world of contracts and numbers, the people who could ensure that every thread was tied off in my favor. I dug through my drawer for the business cards I had kept over the years. My lawyer, a man who had once helped me secure the deed to my house, and my banker, who had guided me through the maze of refinancing when I nearly lost everything to send my daughter to college. They were professionals, efficient and meticulous, and when I sat down across from them with the folder of contracts spread before me, I saw no judgment in their eyes, only focus. My lawyer leaned over the papers, reading through every clause with the calm of a man who had seen countless people try to twist the law to their advantage. "These are in your name," he said firmly, tapping the stack with his pen. "You signed them, you funded them, and that means you hold the power to withdraw." His voice carried the weight of finality, and I felt a surge of vindication ripple through me. My banker, just as precise, combed through the transactions and confirmed what I already knew. Every payment, every deposit, every scheduled withdrawal bore my name, not theirs. "You have full rights to stop these," he assured me, his tone professional, but tinged with something like respect. Together they walked me through the process, line by line, ensuring every cancellation was done legally, every withdrawal documented, every liability shifted to where it truly belonged, my daughter and her arrogant groom. I signed the forms with a steady hand, each stroke of the pen cutting the strings that had bound me to their ungrateful lives. There was a strange poetry in it, the way official stamps and signatures transformed my fury into reality, the way the cold precision of law and finance became the instruments of my justice. I was no longer just an old man lashing out in anger. I was a strategist, using the very systems they had taken for granted to dismantle the empire they thought they had built. When the final form was signed, My lawyer leaned back in his chair and looked at me with an expression that was almost approving. "You've done the right thing," he said quietly, and though I knew his words were rooted in legal fact, I felt the truth of them settle in my chest. My banker offered a small nod, adding, "They'll learn quickly what it means to take without respect." I left their offices lighter than I had felt in years, the folder now filled with stamped documents that transferred every ounce of responsibility back onto the shoulders of the very people who had told me I didn't belong. For so long, I had been the silent provider, the man who signed papers without question, who bore the weight of others' expectations without protest. But now, I was the one in control, and the professionals who had guided me ensured there would be no loopholes, no way for my daughter or her groom to twist the situation to their advantage. Everything was airtight, binding, final. As I walked home with the evening sun dipping low in the sky, I felt a calm unlike any I had known before, a calm born not of surrender but of certainty. The wheels had been set in motion, the foundation of their perfect wedding had been stripped away, and soon the consequences would come crashing down around them. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, humiliated me, but now, with the law and the bank on my side, I was no longer just their victim, I was the architect of their downfall. It did not take long for the first cracks to appear, and when they did, I savored every moment as though it were the finest meal I had ever tasted. Within days of my cancellations, the vendors I had so carefully withdrawn from began reaching out to the bride and groom directly, their once smooth preparations now colliding with the harsh reality of unpaid balances. The caterer, whose spread of lavish dishes had been one of the highlights they boasted about to their friends, sent an urgent email demanding immediate payment to continue services. I imagined the groom opening that message, his confident smirk faltering as he realized the feast he had bragged about was now nothing more than numbers on an invoice he had no means to cover. Not long after, the florist called, her tone sharp and impatient, insisting that without the remainder of the payment, the cascading arrangements of roses and lilies would not leave her shop. The photographer, too, sent notice that he would not step foot in the hall without the full fee in hand, and the dressmaker reminded them of the unpaid balance on the gown my daughter had so proudly worn. Each demand was like music to me. Every ring of their phones, every knock on their door, another note in a symphony of unraveling. I knew their finances, knew the groom's arrogance was not backed by wealth, but by bravado, and I could picture the panic that must have filled their faces as they scrambled to respond. I could almost hear their frantic conversations, my daughter's voice rising in desperation, the groom's tone sharp with frustration as they argued over how this could be happening. They had believed everything was set in stone, that the old man had paved the road smooth for them as always, but without me, their world was built on sand. With each passing day, more calls came, more notices arrived, and the illusion of their perfect wedding began to crumble piece by piece. Friends and relatives who had once admired their grand plans started to hear whispers of trouble, whispers that spread quickly, because vendors talk and gossip has a way of slipping through cracks like water. I imagined their growing embarrassment as they tried to cover the truth, claiming delays, inventing excuses, all while drowning under the mounting pressure of demands they could not meet. And through it all, I felt no guilt, no remorse, only a grim satisfaction that justice was finally taking shape. For years I had been the one to answer the phone, to bear the weight of responsibility, to shield them from the consequences of their own entitlement, but now the burden rested squarely on their shoulders, where it belonged. Every vendor who demanded payment was not just a creditor knocking at their door. They were messengers of a truth my daughter and her groom had refused to see. The truth that they had built their lives on a foundation they did not earn, a foundation I had withdrawn with a single choice. As I sat in my chair, the phone silent at last in my home, I pictured theirs ringing relentlessly, their confidence unraveling with each call, their pride dissolving into panic, and I let the thought fill me with the kind of satisfaction I had been denied for far too long. They had thought they could strip me of my dignity, but in their desperation, they were the ones left exposed, and I was the one who finally felt free. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, but while the sun shone outside, inside their carefully constructed dream, a storm was brewing. A storm I had set in motion with my steady hand and cold resolve. I did not need to be present to see it unfold. I could picture it as vividly as if I were standing in the middle of it, every moment etched in my imagination like a painting of justice. The florist was the first to strike, her delivery truck pulling up to the venue only to remain parked outside, the doors locked tight, as her workers refused to unload a single bloom until the balance was cleared. Guests began to arrive, expecting to be greeted by cascades of roses and lilies, but instead they saw bare tables and empty stands where flowers should have stood. Whispers started almost immediately, confusion passing like wildfire as people asked one another what had gone wrong. The caterer followed quickly, calling the groom with a voice that carried the weight of finality, telling him that without full payment, the food would not leave their kitchens. Hours before the ceremony was to begin, the kitchen at the venue was bare, and the staff who had been scheduled to serve quietly slipped away, shaking their heads at the chaos. I imagined the groom, red-faced and shouting into his phone, trying to demand service as though arrogance could substitute for money, while my daughter stood nearby, her face pale, her hands shaking as her perfect day unraveled thread by thread. And then came the final blow. The venue itself, the very hall where they had humiliated me, turned the key in its great double doors and refused to open them until payment was made. Guests gathered outside, dressed in their finest, fanning themselves in the midday heat, staring at the locked entrance with growing unease. Some tried to reassure one another, saying it must be a delay, a simple mistake. But others began to suspect the truth, their whispers growing louder, more pointed. The spectacle was unavoidable, the humiliation complete, as the couple scrambled in full view of their audience, their grand facade crumbling, while the people they had sought to impress watched with undisguised curiosity. I could imagine the murmurs spreading through the crowd, relatives exchanging knowing looks, old acquaintances leaning in close to share sharp comments. "Did you hear? They haven't paid." All of this, and it wasn't even theirs to begin with. I heard her father pulled out. Every rumor was a dagger, every whisper a confirmation of their downfall. The photographs they had dreamed of, the ones meant to capture a perfect day, instead recorded chaos guests standing outside in confusion, my daughter in her white dress near tears, the groom gesturing wildly as he argued with staff who had heard enough of his empty promises. Some guests began to leave, others lingered out of morbid curiosity, watching the disaster unfold like a play too dramatic to look away from. I could see it all without being there, could feel the justice of it ripple through me like a balm to the wound they had inflicted. This was no longer my humiliation, it was theirs, laid bare before the very people they had sought to impress. The wedding that was meant to mark the start of their triumphant new life had become a public display of failure, a stage upon which their arrogance and greed collapsed under their own weight. And though I sat far from the chaos, in the quiet of my home, I could not help the grim satisfaction that curled in my chest. They had told me I did not belong. They had cast me out of their moment of glory. But as their perfect day turned to ashes before their eyes, it was my absence, my silence, my refusal to carry them any longer that had written the ending of their story. I could see it all in my mind as though I were standing among them, the spectacle of arrogance collapsing into chaos, the perfect facade stripped bare for every eye to witness. The groom, so smug and confident when he told me to leave, now lashed out like a cornered animal, his voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd as he shouted at the vendors, the staff, anyone within reach, demanding they honor their contracts while waving his arms like a man drowning in water too deep. But his bluster carried no weight, for contracts are bound to money, and he had none. I imagined his face flushed red, beads of sweat forming at his temples as he barked orders that no one obeyed, his carefully cultivated charm shattered in an instant. My daughter, dressed in white, the picture she had dreamed of since childhood, stood beside him with tears streaming down her face, her mascara streaking black lines across her cheeks as she begged him to fix it, begged the vendors to relent, begged anyone to salvage what was left of her day. Her sobs carried through the crowd, no longer the dignified bride but a broken image of entitlement crumbling under reality. Both families stood in uneasy clusters, some whispering amongst themselves, others watching with arms folded and faces tight with judgment. The groom's parents, once so haughty and proud, looked horrified as the whispers spread through the guests like wildfire, their family name dragged through the mud in real time. My relatives, too, those who had always looked at me as though I were a simple man, now whispered to one another, their eyes wide as the truth began to dawn. The entire grand show had been built on my back, and without me, it had disintegrated into dust. Rumors traveled fast, faster than the tears on my daughter's cheeks. "They didn't pay the florist," someone muttered. "The caterer walked out," another added. "Can you believe the venue locked them out?" Each rumor, though true, grew sharper with every retelling, slicing away what little dignity the couple had left. Some guests shook their heads, muttering about irresponsibility. Others whispered with a hint of delight at seeing the mighty fall. And still others exchanged knowing looks, as though they had always suspected something rotten beneath the glossy exterior. The humiliation was no longer private, it was public, complete, and impossible to hide. Strangers would leave with stories to tell, relatives with gossip to spread, and the memory of this disaster would outlive the marriage itself. The groom's anger only deepened his disgrace, for the more he shouted, the more people saw through him, his voice cracking with desperation rather than authority. My daughter's tears did nothing to soften their judgment. If anything, they amplified it, for sympathy was drowned out by the stark truth of their arrogance laid bare. I sat in the stillness of my home, picturing it all, and for the first time in years I felt no weight on my chest, no ache of sorrow. I felt justice. They had stripped me of dignity before the world, and now the world had seen them stripped of theirs. It was not my voice that condemned them, not my hand that pointed the finger. It was their own actions, their own arrogance, witnessed by every guest who would never forget the day the bride and groom's grand celebration turned into a theater of disgrace. I waited until the chaos had reached its peak, until the shouts of the groom, the sobs of my daughter, and the restless murmurs of the guests blended into a single storm of humiliation before I chose to appear. I did not rush. I did not hurry. I arrived with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had nothing left to fear. The crowd parted slightly as I stepped forward, their eyes turning toward me with shock, some with curiosity, others with a dawning realization that I had not been defeated, I had not been erased, I had been waiting. My daughter saw me first, her tear-streaked face twisting in a mix of despair and fury. And then the groom turned, his expression a mask of rage barely concealing panic. I did not raise my voice. I did not gesture wildly as he had. I simply stood tall, my back straight, my chin steady, and let the weight of my presence settle over them like a judgment they could not escape. "What's the matter?" I asked softly, though my words carried easily through the crowd. "Isn't this what you wanted? For me to stay out of it?" Silence fell for a heartbeat, thick and heavy, and I could see the meaning of my words sink into them. The groom clenched his fists, his face burning red, while my daughter looked at me as if she had seen a ghost, her lips parting but no words coming out. I let the silence linger, savoring the tension, the shift in power that tilted the room back toward me. "You told me I didn't belong," I continued, my voice calm, measured, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. "So I left. I stayed out of it, exactly as you asked. And this," I gestured to the locked doors, the empty tables, the restless guests, "is what remains without me." Gasps rippled through the crowd, confirmation of the rumors they had already begun to piece together. The groom tried to speak, tried to bluster his way back into control, but his words faltered, breaking apart under the weight of his own panic. "You can't just," he started. But I cut him off with nothing more than a steady gaze, the kind that comes from a lifetime of sacrifice and a heart hardened by betrayal. "I can," I said simply, and I did. My daughter's tears slowed as she stared at me, her face pale, her hands trembling at her sides. For a moment I thought she might reach out, might beg, might finally see me not as a burden, but as the man who had carried her through life. But no words came. Instead, she stood frozen, caught between the husband who had mocked me and the father who had finally stepped out of the shadows. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers swelling again, but now they carried a different tone, one of understanding, of recognition, of acknowledgement that the man they had pitied had not been weak, but deliberate, calculated, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stood there calm and dignified, the eye of the storm, and for the first time in years I felt seen, not as a resource, not as a burden, but as a man who had taken control of his own story. They had asked me to stay out of it, and I had obeyed in the cruelest, most absolute way possible, and now they were left to face the wreckage of their own arrogance. The silence that followed my words was quickly shattered by desperation, the groom's arrogance collapsing into frantic pleas as he stepped toward me, his voice trembling despite the forced bravado he tried to layer over it. "Please," he said, his tone raw and uneven, "you can't do this to us, not now, not in front of everyone. Just fix it, pay them, and we'll talk later." The shift in his demeanor was almost laughable. The same man who had once sneered that I was a burden, now begging for the very support he had scorned. His hands shook as he gestured wildly, his voice cracking with each syllable, and the crowd that had once seen him as charming now saw him for what he was, a man crumbling under the weight of his own hubris. My daughter, meanwhile, turned her fury on me, her tears drying into streaks of bitterness as she spat out words sharper than any knife. "How could you do this to me?" she cried, her voice shrill with accusation. "I'm your daughter. I'm supposed to count on you. You ruined everything." Her blame poured out in a torrent, her face twisted in rage and disbelief, as if she truly could not comprehend that the man who had given her everything would one day stop. She spoke of betrayal as though she were the victim, never once acknowledging the cold indifference she had shown me, the silence she had kept when her groom humiliated me, the years she had drained me dry without a word of thanks. I let her speak, let them both flail in their desperation, and when their voices finally cracked and faltered, I answered in the same calm, steady tone I had carried all along. "No," I said, my voice low but cutting through their cries with the finality of truth. "I didn't ruin anything. You did. With your greed, with your disrespect, with the way you looked at me as nothing more than a wallet to open and close at your convenience." My eyes moved from the groom to my daughter, meeting each of theirs with unflinching resolve. "Do you think I didn't hear him?" I asked, nodding toward the man she had chosen. "Do you think I didn't know he called me a burden, told his friends I should stay out of sight? Do you think I didn't see your silence when he said it again on your wedding day, in front of everyone, while you stood there and let him?" Gasps rippled through the onlookers as the truth came to light, the whispers swelling as the weight of my revelation spread through the hall. The groom's face drained of color, his lips fumbling for words he could not form, and my daughter's eyes widened in shock as she realized I had known all along. I stepped closer, not with aggression, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had carried enough shame for a lifetime. "You thought I was blind, thought I was weak, thought my love for you would make me endure anything," I continued, my voice steady, measured, inescapable. "But love is not slavery, respect is not optional, and dignity, my dignity, is not something you can take from me." The groom stammered again, reaching for my arm as though to pull me back into his control, but I stepped away, unmoved, untouched by his desperation. My daughter's blame faltered into silence, her accusation swallowed by the truth hanging heavy in the air. I had revealed the rot at the core of their union, exposed their greed and their disrespect, not with anger but with cold, undeniable clarity, and in that moment the balance of power was no longer theirs. It was mine. The murmurs of the crowd swelled into an uneasy hum as I stood before them, their eyes darting between my daughter's tear-streaked face, the groom's pale and trembling features, and my own calm, unwavering stance. They were waiting, all of them, waiting for me to bend, to relent, to return to the role I had played my entire life, the quiet provider who endured humiliation for the sake of keeping peace. But that man was gone, and in his place stood someone they had never known, someone who carried the full weight of sacrifice and betrayal, yet refused to bow beneath it any longer. I let the silence stretch, let the tension rise until it was nearly unbearable, and then I spoke the words that would shatter what little remained of their illusion. "You should know," I began, my voice steady and deliberate, "that I did more than cancel the payments. I did more than take back your flowers, your food, your venue, your little honeymoon getaway. I went deeper, further, into the very foundation of what you thought you would inherit. I have changed my will, I have changed my accounts, and as of now, you, my daughter, are no longer my heir." A sharp gasp tore through the crowd, the sound of 100 conversations breaking at once. My daughter's eyes widened in disbelief, her mouth falling open as if I had struck her across the face. The groom staggered back a step, the color draining from his cheeks until he looked as lifeless as the locked hall behind him. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I simply laid the truth before them with the weight of finality. Every dollar, every asset, every piece of land, the home I built with my hands, all of it is secured, untouchable, by either of you. The banks have been informed, the documents signed, and notarized. If you thought my death would one day enrich you, if you thought you could tolerate me until I was gone so you could profit from the years of my labor, you were mistaken. My daughter's tears came again, but they were not the tears of grief or love. They were tears of loss, of entitlement stripped bare, of a future slipping through her grasp. She stumbled forward, her voice cracking as she cried, "You can't do this to me. I'm your daughter. Everything you built, it's supposed to be mine." Her words, sharp and desperate, revealed her heart more clearly than I ever could. It had never been about love, never about gratitude. It had always been about possession, about what she could take. The groom, his mask of arrogance finally shattered, tried to speak, tried to smooth it over, but his words faltered into nothing as the crowd watched his downfall. I looked at her, really looked at her, this woman who had once been my little girl, the child I had carried through sleepless nights, the child I had sacrificed everything for, and I felt the ache of loss in my chest, but it was not for her love. It was for the illusion I had clung to, the belief that my devotion would one day be returned. That illusion was gone, and in its place was the cold clarity of truth. "Blood may make you my daughter," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through her sobs. "But respect, gratitude, and love are what make you my family. And you gave those away long ago." The room was silent except for her cries, the whispers of the guests subdued now, their eyes wide with the weight of what they had witnessed. I had taken back not only their wedding but their future, had severed the last tie that bound me to their greed, and in that moment I felt not regret, not guilt, but a deep and resounding peace. They had erased me from their lives long before this day. All I had done was make it official. I did not linger to watch their collapse, for my words had already done what years of silent sacrifice never could. They had carved the truth into stone for everyone to see. With the calm dignity they had mistaken for weakness, I turned my back on the chaos, my steps measured and unhurried as I walked away from the ruins of their perfect day. Behind me, I could still hear the groom's broken pleas, my daughter's ragged sobs, the restless murmurs of the crowd. But those sounds grew fainter with every step I took until they were nothing but echoes fading into the distance. I had no need to stay, no need to bear witness to the ashes of their arrogance. My role was finished, my purpose fulfilled. As I made my way home, the evening air cool against my skin, my thoughts drifted to the house I had built so many years ago, a house born from grief and love, from the calloused hands of a widowed man determined to give his daughter a safe haven in a world that had already taken too much. I had poured myself into those walls, hammering away not just nails but the pain of losing her mother, filling every corner with the promise that she would never be alone. For decades, that house had stood as a symbol of devotion, of resilience, of a father's vow. But now, as I stood before it, staring at its familiar frame under the dim glow of twilight, I saw it differently. The paint I had refreshed year after year, the repairs I had made at every crack and leak, the countless hours I had spent ensuring it was warm, secure, and welcoming, all of it now looked hollow, stripped of meaning. What I had once believed was a monument to love had revealed itself to be something else entirely, a hollow monument to misplaced love, to sacrifices wasted on a heart that never truly valued them. Every board, every beam, every nail seemed to whisper back at me, asking why I had given so much, why I had built so fiercely for someone who would grow to cast me aside. I stood there for a long moment, letting the truth sink into my bones, and then I felt a strange calm wash over me. The house would stand, as it always had, but it no longer held me captive. It no longer bound me to the illusion that love and gratitude would one day flow back into its walls. It was just wood and stone now, no longer a shrine to her, but a reminder to me of what I had endured, of what I had learned, of what I would never repeat. With that realization, I turned the key in the lock, the door creaking open to welcome me back into solitude, and for the first time in decades, I did not feel like a prisoner in my own home. I felt free. I left the wedding behind. I left her behind. And with it, I left the weight of a lifetime of misplaced devotion. The monument still stood, but it no longer owned me. News of the disaster spread faster than wildfire, carried not by official announcements, but by the tongues of gossiping relatives, stunned guests, and even the vendors who had been left unpaid and insulted. Within days, the story of the ruined wedding became the talk of every circle my daughter and her groom had so desperately tried to impress. People whispered about locked doors, about flowers that never arrived, about guests left sweltering outside in their finest clothes, and about the shocking reveal that the father of the bride had withdrawn everything, leaving the couple to face the shame they had brought upon themselves. Rumors twisted and grew, some exaggerating the chaos, others embellishing my final confrontation, but all carried the same core truth. Their perfect facade had collapsed in front of everyone. The groom's family, once so proud and haughty, wasted no time severing ties. To them, the humiliation was unforgivable, the stain on their name too great to endure. They distanced themselves quickly, whispering that they had never approved of the match, that the groom's arrogance had led him astray, that my daughter had encouraged recklessness. Their support evaporated overnight, leaving the newlyweds to fend for themselves in the wreckage of their failed union. Financially, they were exposed. Without my steady hand funding their dreams, the bills arrived like vultures circling a carcass. The caterer demanded payment in full. The florist threatened legal action. The photographer held their memories hostage behind invoices, and the travel agency kept their honeymoon funds as a penalty for cancellation. Creditors called daily, each demand another blow to their fragile pride, and soon their savings, what little they had, was bled dry. They sold jewelry, pawned electronics, and begged for loans from friends who had once admired their status, but now looked at them with disdain. Invitations to parties stopped coming. Once welcoming smiles turned into smirks or cold stares. The couple who had basked in admiration were now the subject of ridicule, their names whispered with mocking laughter at gatherings. "Did you hear about the wedding that fell apart?" People would say, always followed by their names, as though they had become synonymous with failure itself. Their social standing crumbled as swiftly as their finances, and they found themselves alone, stripped of the very validation they had built their lives around. My daughter, who had once looked at me with eyes filled with cold dismissal, now tasted the bitterness of rejection herself. As doors closed in her face and friends she had counted on drifted away. The groom, who had mocked me as an old burden, now carried the weight of his own arrogance, his voice no longer charming but desperate as he scrambled for opportunities that never came. And through it all, I watched from a distance, not with glee but with grim satisfaction, for justice had unfolded exactly as it should. They had tried to erase me, to humiliate me, to strip me of dignity in front of the world, but in the end it was their dignity that lay in ruins, their world that had crumbled, their names that had become a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. Their downfall was not my doing alone. It was the natural consequence of their greed, their disrespect, their arrogance, finally meeting the wall of reality. I did not need to lift another finger. The world itself carried out the rest of the punishment. In the quiet that followed their downfall, I found myself sitting once more in the chair that had borne witness to my grief, my rage, and my resolve. Only this time the silence no longer weighed upon me like a curse. It was a different kind of silence now, not empty or suffocating, but calm, almost sacred, the kind that comes when a storm has passed and the air is fresh with the promise of peace. I thought of my daughter, of the child I had once carried through sleepless nights, and the woman she had become, a woman who had chosen to cast me aside in favor of wealth and appearances. That loss still ached within me, a dull throb that I knew would never fully fade, but it no longer consumed me. For so long I had believed her love was worth the breaking of my back, the hollowing of my soul, but I understood now that love without respect is no love at all. What I had lost was not truly mine to begin with, and what I had gained in its place was far more valuable, my dignity. They had tried to take it from me, to strip me bare before the world, but in the end, it was I who walked away with my head high, while they were left drowning in the ruins of their own arrogance. There was a quiet triumph in that, a vindication that filled me more completely than applause or approval ever could. I no longer carried the weight of unreturned sacrifices, no longer shackled myself to the illusion that my worth was measured by what I gave to those who only took. I had proven, to them and to myself, that even the man they thought weak, invisible, replaceable, had the power to turn their world upside down with nothing more than the truth and the withdrawal of his hand. That was my last laugh, not loud or mocking, but steady, enduring, a laugh written into the very fabric of their downfall. They would remember me, not as the quiet figure in the background, but as the man who stood up at last and reminded them what strength truly was. And as the whispers of their scandal faded into the background noise of the world, I sat in my home, my hollow monument of misplaced love now reclaimed as my sanctuary, and I felt something I had not felt in years. Peace. It was not the peace of ignorance, nor the fragile peace of endurance, but the unshakable peace of a man who had faced betrayal, endured humiliation, and emerged stronger, freer, and whole. I may have lost a daughter's love, but I regained myself, and in the end, that was the greater victory. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.